Welcome back to Bob Dylan Song by Song, Masters of War, simply the most devastating anti-war song of all time. And if you look at this illustration here, this vintage cartoon, you'll see the central theme, I think. Rich man's war, poor man's fight. As I understand it, that saying came out of the U.S. Civil War. Regardless, it's obviously a critique on who does the fighting versus who does the planning. Or more to the point, who does the profiting. This is an extremely direct song, but it's not simple or simplistic, not at all. He wants to look beyond the obvious and ask why wars happen. In that quest, he, and I would say correctly, centers on money. And that's why this song's lyrical weapons are aimed at war profiteers in particular. And this is something we're going to see a lot in Dylan's career. He's looking beyond what Melville would call the pasteboard masks. That insight and focus aside, one thing that's really extraordinary about the song is the timing. This came out on the Freewheelin', which came out in 1963. That is a decade removed from America's last major war, the Korea War, and at least a couple years preceding America's next major war, of course, being Vietnam. The Vietnam War, of course, spurred a tsunami of great anti-war, protest, peace songs, whatever you want to call them, transcendent talents like John Lennon writing Give Peace a Chance, etc., but he and all the others were spurred by something that was immediate, like in their face, right? The Vietnam War. Look at this protest here, this picture. That's from a Vietnam War protest, from the height of that movement. But imagine that Dylan wrote the most biting anti-war song when none of this was happening. The Gulf of Tonkin incident wasn't going to happen for another year. America's first real combat troops weren't going to arrive in Vietnam for 2 years. And as I mentioned, the last war was 10 years removed when Dylan was just a kid and probably not concerned with such things. It really speaks to his ability to perceive injustice and address it in songs, but not tie them too specifically to anything, just as in Blowin' in the Wind, right? The kickoff song from this same album. And he does it here again. This song is universally applicable. It's to the human condition, the constant state of war, not just to one conflict, much less an impossible to ignore one because it was happening, right in his eyes, watching his friends get drafted, etc. As in so many of the Vietnam War protest songs, not that there's reason to criticize those songwriters for writing those songs at that time. Made perfect sense. Regardless, I think one of the hallmarks of great art is that it's timeless, or has a timeless quality. And we're looking at a timeless piece of great art right now. I'm going to show some prints from Francisco Goya's Los Desastres de la Guerra, The Disasters of War. Now, these were made from about 1810 to 1820 and involved the Napoleonic Peninsular War in Spain. The BBC called these the most searing works of art, or work of art overall, involving war or on conflict. I think that's a great word, searing, and to circle back, I think it describes Masters of War perfectly. And it's interesting to notice that there's a similarity in that Goya chooses to focus particularly on the horrors of war, and that's what Dylan does as well. As we'll see when we get to the lyrics, the difference, of course, being the central focus of the song, which is the Masters of War, those who cause it for their own gain, and then that being the greatest horror of all. So yeah, I think this song is brilliant. I think it's actually just a perfect song. Wouldn't change one thing about it. That would then obviously include the arrangement, so we should point out that the music is based on an Old English ballad, which then was picked up in the Appalachian Mountains in America, called Nottingham Town. Now, it's not a straight-up use of the original melody. Dylan has a real driving, steady, waves crashing on the ocean type sound in his song. It's just this salvo after salvo, attack after attack, as he hurls these accusations. The original ballad doesn't have that, but what it does have is what a lot of those kind of Americana, transatlantic, transport-type songs have, which is this wonderful, haunting quality. So really what he does is kind of takes the rhythm and cranks it up, right? It ups the intensity, which matches the intensity of the lyrics and subject matter. So once again, we're at Dylan's, transformative art, right? Taking things from different places. You've got this sound based on one time and place. You've got these much more current concerns. You're no longer talking about an ancient English town. You're talking about modern war, the industrialization of war, the subsequent profiteering, and you've got basically prophesying, because how unbelievable that this is being done in the early 60s prior to this massive U.S. war, the first one in a long time, and the most needless one, possibly in the country's history, yet one that made an unbelievable amount of money for arms manufacturers. Manufacturers were often quite close to or in bed with the politicians who started the war. Change of visual, by the way, we're looking at Guernica by Pablo Picasso, so another all-time great piece of visual art on war by one of the greatest painters of all time, who also happens to be from Spain, just like Goya. But I should really move on to the song. So what does Dylan do here, lyrically, structurally, that he hasn't done in the songs we already looked at? Well, a lot. For one thing, note that this has 64 lines, right? 8 stanzas, 8 verses. So it's kind of a monster song compared to anything we've seen before. The next 3 images, by the way, starting with this one here, are Hiroshima. It's Hiroshima before the bomb, after the bomb, and a mother and her son recovering. So you've got these 8 verses, 8 lines each, and they conform very much to kind of a narrow band. I mean visually, so if you're crazy like me and you have a spreadsheet with all the lyrics, then you notice when you get to this song that it's like a very consistent column, the words here, right? They don't vary widely like they do in a lot of his songs. You'll have a very long line followed by a short line, just depends. So they never go past 6 words in a line, and they almost, with one exception, don't go below 4. So 4 to 6 words in every line, essentially. So that's very rhythmic. And I don't mean rhythmic in terms of the sound, the music, but in terms of the words. And that's really what the song does structurally. It's really based on this kind of like machine gun burst, very steady, very consistent attack, and that's really appropriate given the subject matter. I don't mean that Dylan thought of that analogy himself or tried to use it in the song, but it's just that kind of feel, like he's just prosecuting this one-sided attack against his opponents and doesn't even want to give them a chance to breathe. You know, what they've done is so horrible that they don't seem worthy of anything except a prosecutorial case, and that's what this is. You know, the first 5 verses basically just list out the sins of these people, and within those 5 verses directly addresses them, depends on how you want to count, but 17 times. The last 3 verses then pass judgment and essentially condemn the accused here. One thing we can definitely say is that this song is not afraid to pass judgment. Dylan does that himself. He doesn't ask us to do it. He's not putting the case for us for our decision. He takes it all on himself. That's what the songwriter does in this song, which is one of the things I think makes it pretty noteworthy. Speaking of his thoughts, he said, quote, "I've never written anything like that before. I don't sing songs which hope people will die, but I couldn't help it with this one." And for all the nerding out I'm going to do on Dylan's wordplay and that kind of thing in this song, like with all the others, that is really the defining characteristic of this song and why it's so enduring, is the visceral nature of it. His singing is fantastic on this. I think it really rises to the occasion of the song. It's not operatic, obviously, but if you listen to his phrasing, he bites off words, cuts off words to kind of punctuate the ends of lines. It's really, I think, a strong performance and appropriate. There's a definite righteous indignation that doesn't come off as shrill, doesn't come off as over the top, and in fact it's maybe even more effective because it's kind of understated. And we should also note this is a sign of something we're going to see throughout his career. You know, one of his particular hallmarks is he has a nasty streak that's used to very great effect and for good purpose here. Maybe not so much in other songs, but we'll get to those later. Still, it's there, and it's something that a lot of singer-songwriters don't really showcase, do they? But he does, and he does it with relish. He has a lot of revenge songs. You know, he has great love songs, but he also has probably the greatest breakup songs, like angry breakup songs of all time. So let's get into a little bit of detail. We talked about the steady, driving nature of the song. Let's look at just the first stanza for an example of how it just kind of drives the point home and just keeps punching and punching. So I'll use the official version of the lyrics here from BobDylan.com. "Come, you masters of war, you that build all the guns, you that build the death planes, you that build the big bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. I just want you to know I can see through your masks." There are no lyrical gymnastics there or flowery language like we'll see in so many later songs, but you have kind of this brick-by-brick approach, right? These simple, short words stacked on top of each other, short lines stacked on top of each other, and you probably wouldn't notice, but all 8 of those lines have the exact same number of syllables. And notice you don't get that effect just by using the same number of words. All the lines are almost the same number of words, like I mentioned before, but you wouldn't get the same number of syllables, so you kind of have to be careful, or maybe he just, does this as like a savant, it's accidental, but, you that hide behind walls, well, behind is 2 syllables. You that build the big bombs, big is just 1 syllable, so it breaks words up where it needs to and uses short words in other places to end up at the exact same number of syllables for every single line. And my hypothesis, for whatever it's worth, when it comes to all these different tricks and games that seem to be played with Dylan's lyrics and wordplay is that that has an effect on us. I mean, artistically, it makes a difference. That kind of steady structure there that we never really think about or notice, I think it makes the song that much more driving in its effect. So that kind of thing, in theory, works on you in conjunction with the things you do notice, like lines like, "You hide in your mansion as young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud." That kind of thing you're going to notice, and that's how almost all the lines in the song are. They're just really impossible to ignore in terms of how sharp they are. These are, stiletto blades of lines. Further on, "Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find, when your death takes its toll, all the money you made will never buy back your soul." And that's about as stinging as song lyrics get in, popular American music. A lot of Dylan-esque tricks, of course, with the verbiage. One stanza ends, "That runs down my drain." It's talking about water. "Like I see through the water that runs down my drain." Another stanza later in the song, not the very next one, so later on, ends, "You ain't worth the blood that runs in your veins." And you're invited to think about, to be reminded about the water that was flowing previously, and again, like we talked about in previous videos, it kind of matches metaphorically, not just phonetically, because you've got this liquid running, right? Same thing happens later, when one section ends with a very memorable, "But there's one thing I know, though I'm younger than you, even Jesus would never forgive what you do." Then the end of the next stanza, so the corresponding end, is the couplet we already read, which ends with, "All the money you made will never buy back your soul." So you've got that meaningful juxtaposition again, and this, of course, kind of brings back in that moral judgment of the song, even confidently declaring that the people he's singing to are going to hell. And that, in turn, kind of reminds you of far earlier in the song, when the Masters of War compared to Judas. Well, all the money you made will never buy back your soul. Judas, of course, was paid to betray Jesus and was not forgiven. Speaking of the Judas line, below that it says, "You lie and deceive, a world war can be won, you want me to believe." Deceive and believe make a great rhyme because, again, there's meaning there. They're both about faith, about what you believe. Well, it's just such a great song. One other thing I'd point out is that we talked about the first 5 parts being very consistent and forming like one argument. So there's a real turning point after that. If you notice, if you go from 6 to 8, the last 3 parts, you'll notice that after that turn, they change in narrative, but they also build in intensity. And they do that wonderfully, culminating in probably the most devastating set of passages in, pop rock history. And I've pilfered directly from the lyrics more than enough, so you can look at those yourself. Masters of War is always going to be used when people are indignant about an ongoing conflict, or just about the existence of war, the injustice of war itself. And just one of the reasons that this song will always be around is that, unfortunately, as far as we know, that state of affairs will also always be around. Thanks.